It began as a ghost on the airwaves, an aircraft that should have been silent, buried in snow and twisted metal. Yet for 3 long days after the crash, its voice kept bleeding into the radios of Allied and Axis operators alike. In the vast, chaotic theater of World War II, where every signal could shift the fate of a convoy or the timing of an assault, this one bomber became an impossible anomaly. It should have died on impact. Instead, it kept transmitting coded fragments, half-words, and broken identifiers as if some unseen hand refused to let it fall quiet. The final mission of the aircraft, a B-24 Liberator assigned to deep reconnaissance over occupied territory, began under an indifferent morning sky. The war in Europe had entered its crueler, more calculating phase. By late 1943, Allied bombers were tearing through industrial corridors across Germany, and the Luftwaffe, though wounded, still fought with desperate precision. These missions were not heroic charges. They were methodical, freezing, suffocating hours spent in thin air with the constant threat of flak-tearing steel like paper. But reconnaissance flights carried a different burden. They traveled alone. The bomber's crew, veterans hardened by relentless raids, lifted off knowing the risks. Their task was simple on paper: photograph rail lines, supply nodes, and artillery staging near the frontier. But such missions were lotteries of survival. On radar, they were just another blip. In reality, they were flying steel coffins. The sky was deceptively calm until the ground below erupted. The aircraft drifted directly into a corridor of German flak batteries concealed along a river bend. Anti-aircraft shells burst with unnatural symmetry around the bomber, black blossoms of smoke flickering with lethal fragments. One explosion struck the right wing, ripping through fuel lines. Another blast tore into the communications bay, showering the radio operator with sparks. The B-24 lurched, engines coughing like dying animals. Smoke trailed behind it in dark, spiraling ribbons. Inside, panic and discipline wrestled for control. The intercom crackled with orders: feather the prop, reroute power, check hydraulics. But the damage spread too quickly. The pilot fought the stick as if wrestling a living thing, trying to keep the Liberator's nose up long enough to clear the cliffs ahead. During those last moments of flight, the crew sent a standard SOS burst, an automated sequence meant to guide search teams later. They expected it to be their final transmission. It should have been. The bomber slammed into a frozen hillside with catastrophic force. Trees shattered. Snow exploded upward in a blinding wave. The fuselage split apart like a crushed shell, scattering metal fragments across the ravine. Silence followed, deep winter silence that swallowed everything. In the official logs that would later be compiled, the aircraft was marked simply as lost. And yet, hours later, when the world around the wreck slept, the first impossible signal escaped the ruin. At a distant listening post manned by Allied Signal Corps operators, a faint rhythmic pulse cut through the static. It carried the bomber's call sign, distorted but unmistakable. Operators froze, adjusting dials and narrowing frequency windows. They assumed it was an echo, a clipped fragment bouncing across atmospheric layers. But the pulse repeated, and then repeated again. A crashed bomber cannot transmit. This simple truth was learned through thousands of wartime losses. Radios shattered, power died, wiring burned, human hands, shaking, freezing, bleeding, were no longer there to work the keys. And yet the code patterns coming through matched the Liberator's encrypted identifier. Short bursts, pauses, a looping cadence that mirrored a manual key sequence. By the second day, Allied intelligence was alerted. The signals were not automated SOS echoes. They were directional, faintly shifting as if the transmitter had been disturbed or partially buried. Signal towers triangulated them, drawing rough coordinates deep inside contested territory. The bomber was broadcasting from the crash site. Some analysts believed a crew member might have survived long enough to continue tapping out distress codes. But the transmissions did not match human behavior. They were too consistent. Too cold, too perfectly imperfect, looping with slight degradation each cycle. A wounded man could not sustain such precision. A dying man could not do it for 3 days. As Allied teams struggled to make sense of it, German intercept operators encountered the same anomaly. They picked up the looping fragments and flagged them as suspicious. In the Second World War, phantom transmissions often suggested deception operations. Fake broadcasts were tools of psychological warfare, capable of drawing forces into traps or masking troop movements. But this signal lacked the structure of a counterfeit operation. It was broken, ragged, clinging to coherence like a machine refusing to die. While both sides monitored the mysterious broadcast, reconnaissance patrols were dispatched to locate the aircraft. Snowfall slowed the search to a crawl. The crash site was buried in shifting drifts, and enemy patrols threatened to close in. Hours slipped into days as both armies followed the same dwindling thread of radio static toward the frozen wreck. Inside the ravine, beneath snow and twisted aluminum, the bomber's radio compartment lay crushed. The operator's station was torn open, wires exposed like nerves. The radio receiver was shattered beyond recognition. The transmitter chassis, though mangled, still clung to one corner of the fuselage. It was impossible for it to be functioning. The power unit had ruptured during impact. The auxiliary batteries were split open. The crewmen nearby were motionless, their final moments locked in ice. No human hands remained to send anything, yet the signal continued, growing weaker each hour. At listening stations, code clerks scribbled notes. They tracked the drift in frequency, the slow decay of output power, the strange stuttering intervals that suggested damage rather than intention. Intelligence officers compared the pattern to the bomber's pre-crash transmission habits. Some similarities emerged, timing quirks unique to that crew's operator, a man known for his steady but slightly uneven key rhythm. But this was conjecture layered onto tragedy. Machines do not inherit the habits of their operators. Metal does not remember. As the third day approached, the transmissions shifted once more. The pattern stuttered, halted, resumed with reduced strength. Analysts believed the circuitry was freezing, collapsing under the cold. Some interpreted the final bursts as the transmitter's last electrical breath. Others, more unsettled, noted that the final code sequence resembled an incomplete message. 3 characters that formed no known identifier, no standard distress code. They ended abruptly, swallowed by static. Moments later, the frequency went silent forever. The search patrols arrived hours after the last signal. They found the wreckage half consumed by snow. There were no survivors, no signs of recent movement, no footprints, no melted patches indicating warmth. The radio compartment was inspected with grim fascination. Engineers took notes documenting damage that should have rendered the equipment lifeless on impact. And yet, for 3 nights, a dead aircraft had spoken. The report compiled afterward was stamped and archived under restricted access. In a war where secrecy was oxygen, the anomaly was filed away rather than explained. It became a footnote buried in intelligence summaries, referenced only as a post-impact signal irregularity, unresolved. But among the men who monitored the airwaves, the memory lingered. They spoke in low tones about the bomber that refused silence, the machine that kept sending its fractured heartbeat into the void long after life had left it. They knew that the war was full of impossibilities. But this one felt different, colder, closer, like the echo of something unfinished. When the reports reached the Regional Intelligence Command, the officers treated them with the same mixture of skepticism and obligation common to wartime anomalies. The Second World War was overflowing with misread signals, phantom blips, and atmospheric distortions that mimicked intent. Most were harmless artifacts of strained equipment and chaotic skies. But this case had documentation, triangulation logs, operator notes, and a precise correlation with a verified crash. It could not be dismissed as mere imagination. Investigators traced the final known trajectory of the bomber, reconstructing the last 20 minutes of its doomed flight. Damage assessments indicated that the communications array had taken a direct hit from flak. The shock wave should have severed the cabling feeding the transmitter. Instead, the wiring was found fused in place, melted and then rehardened by the intense heat of the blast. Power should not have been able to flow through it. Yet a few strands survived, their copper cores partially intact, threading chaotically across metal fragments. Some engineers later theorized that, in the final moments, when the aircraft tore apart on impact, the violent compression of metal may have pinched the surviving wires into makeshift contact points. A dying electrical echo could have looped through the fractured transmitter in an unintended rhythm, turning the machine into a crude, short-lived pulse generator. It was a theory built on desperation, one that attempted to fit logic onto something that refused to align with it. Other analysts pushed a different angle. They believed the bomber's pre-crash SOS transmission, damaged mid-burst, might have become trapped in a feedback loop within the disfigured circuitry. The loops, degrading over time, could have produced seemingly manual code patterns. It was plausible. But the biggest flaw in this hypothesis was the complexity of the signals. They contained variations, a degree of entropy and uneven spacing that matched a human operator more closely than a mechanical repetition. No consensus was reached. In wartime, unresolved mysteries were often buried beneath more urgent crises. As the inquiry continued, search units at the crash site examined the bomber with meticulous care. The snow-covered hillside was cordoned off. Photographs captured every angle: the torn fuselage, the collapsed cockpit, the wing embedded in earth. The engines were frozen in place, propellers bent at impossible angles. The radio operator's station was examined last, its metal housing crushed but still partially recognizable. The operator himself had died instantly. His gloved hand was found near the key, frozen in a final reflex motion, as if he had tried to send one more message before the world went white. For the intelligence team studying the logs, this detail struck a quiet chord. Human instinct often clung to purpose, even in the last breath. But no human action could explain 3 days of post-crash transmissions. That made the scene more haunting. The man's life had ended. His station had not. While Allied teams completed their assessment, enemy patrols had been shadowing the area. The wreckage lay within contested ground, and German scouts sought evidence of whether the bomber's mission involved more than reconnaissance. They recovered fragments of film canisters from the forward compartment, shattered, snow-soaked, useless. They noted the presence of coded message slips, fluttering like paper ghosts inside the broken fuselage. Most were ordinary reconnaissance reports, but one was unusual: a torn slip containing raw signal intercepts, likely collected during the bomber's flight. The Germans could not decipher them. They were fragments, useless alone, but their presence raised questions. Why would a reconnaissance crew be handling intercept material? This sparked rumors among field units. Some believed the bomber had intercepted German communications during its flight, perhaps accidentally tapping into a frequency used by local command. Others suspected the aircraft had been part of a signals experiment, an early attempt at aerial monitoring, a technique that would later become central to electronic warfare. These theories never reached official channels. They remained whispers among soldiers who saw too much and understood too little. On the Allied side, the intelligence meeting convened days later took a colder, more structured approach. Officers gathered under the canvas roof of a debriefing tent, warmed only by a coal stove and the exhaustion of constant analysis. Papers rustled, radios hissed. A chalkboard displayed triangulation plots of the bomber's transmissions. The lead officer outlined the facts. The bomber crashed at 14:32 hours. The first post-crash signal was recorded at 18:07 hours. The transmissions continued for 2 nights and 3 days. The final burst occurred at 05:14 hours on the third morning. The transmitter was destroyed beyond operational capacity. None of these facts could coexist, yet they did. The officers reviewed the frequency analysis charts. They compared the decay curve of the signal strength with the temperature logs from the region. Cold should have killed the equipment long before it did. Wiring should have snapped. Contacts should have frozen. And yet the transmitter clung to life longer than any functional design allowed. They inspected the last transmitted code slip, 3 characters that form no known pattern. Perhaps they were corrupted fragments. Perhaps they were the unsent remainder of the operator's dying message. Or perhaps they were something else, something purely mechanical, an electrical stutter. The debate lasted hours. No resolution emerged. In the end, the report concluded in the language of wartime bureaucracy. Phenomenon unrepeatable, non-replicable, non-actionable, file under signals irregularities. When war devoured thousands of lives each week, mysteries were a luxury few cared to chase. The wreckage was eventually recovered by an Allied engineering team. Components were shipped to a rear area workshop for deeper examination. The radio transmitter was dissected piece by piece. Engineers observed telltale patterns of arcing along the metal frame, evidence of power jumping through places where it should never have traveled. They noted scorched patches where insulation had burned away, replaced by makeshift contact points of fused metal. They debated whether impact forces could realistically create a self-sustaining electrical loop. Some argued yes. Others argued no. Ultimately, the war pulled them in different directions. New equipment demanded testing. New failures required solutions. The mystery transmitter faded into the background noise of conflict. As the conflict intensified, stories of the bomber's ghost signal spread through the ranks of radio operators. They repeated it in mess halls, in freezing outposts, in long night watches where static filled the air like dust. It became a quiet reminder that the war was larger and stranger than any single explanation. Men died every day. Machines failed every hour. Yet sometimes the line between life and death blurred, if only for a moment. To the operators, that bomber wasn't just wreckage. It was a voice that refused to vanish, an echo pushing back against the vast, indifferent silence of war. In the final months of the conflict, when signals intelligence had become one of the most decisive tools of the Second World War, the case resurfaced briefly. A declassified signals file referenced the anomaly as an early example of post-impact frequency persistence. But the phrasing was deliberately vague. No one wished to revisit the details. The war was ending. Mysteries were best left buried. When peace returned, the wreckage was melted down, its components scattered across factories, rebuilding a devastated continent. The transmitter, once the source of so much fascination, was eventually scrapped. No museum piece, no preserved artifact. Just another piece of steel fed into the hungry machinery of reconstruction. But some documents survived. Triangulation logs, operator notebooks, fragments of the coded messages that drifted through the winter air. And every so often, historians rediscovered the case, astonished that such an incident occurred at all. In a conflict defined by overwhelming death and destruction, this one moment, one machine defying its own extinction, reminded them that war produces stories as perplexing as they are tragic. Perhaps the bomber's signals were nothing more than a freak coincidence of physics, a fleeting spark of electricity trapped in a mangled frame. Or perhaps they were something deeper, a final echo of a crew determined to complete their mission even after their lives had ended. No one will ever truly know. What remains is the silence that followed, the abrupt end of a signal that had no right to exist. And in that silence lies the legacy of the Second World War, a reminder that even in an age of machinery and calculation, the war was ultimately shaped by human fragility, human endurance, and the unfathomable moments that lived between life and death. The crashed bomber did not change the course of the war. It did not carry secret cargo or reveal hidden codes. But for 3 days, it spoke when it should have been silent. And in the cold logic of military history, that small defiance endures as one of World War II's quietest, strangest echoes. An unanswered question frozen in time, carried on a signal that should never have been heard.